The old man had lived alone in the desert for nearly 20 years. People in the nearest village called him strange, some even called him crazy. But those who truly knew him understood that he wasn't mad, he was broken. After losing his wife and son in a tragic accident decades ago, he left the city behind and built a small wooden cabin on the edge of a vast, silent desert. Out there, surrounded by endless sand and whispering winds, he found something close to peace. Every morning before sunrise, he would wake up, boil water over a small stove, and sit outside watching the horizon slowly turn from dark blue to gold. The desert had its own language, the shifting dunes, the distant cry of a hawk, the wind carving patterns in the sand. He had learned to read its moods. He knew when a sandstorm was coming long before the sky changed color. He knew which direction to walk to find the rare patches of underground water. The desert was harsh, but it was honest. That morning seemed ordinary. The sky was pale orange, and the air was unusually still. The old man, whose name was Elias, decided to walk farther than usual. He had a habit of wandering, checking old markers he had placed years ago to track the movement of the dunes. As he walked, leaning on his wooden staff, something unusual caught his eye. At first, he thought it was a piece of fabric tangled in the sand. But as he stepped closer, his heart skipped. It wasn't fabric, it was a hand, half buried in the sand, pale and unmoving. For a second, he froze. The desert sometimes revealed bones of animals that had not survived the heat. But this was different. He dropped to his knees and started digging frantically with his bare hands. Sand filled his nails and scratched his skin, but he didn't stop. Slowly, a young woman's face appeared. Her eyes were closed, her lips were dry and cracked. She looked barely alive. "Please," he whispered, though he didn't know to whom. He checked for a pulse. Weak, very weak, but there. Without hesitation, Elias lifted her fragile body into his arms. She felt impossibly light. He carried her back to his cabin, each step heavy but determined. Inside, he laid her on his bed and poured a few drops of water onto her lips. At first, nothing happened. Then, faintly, she swallowed. He mixed water with a little salt and sugar, an old survival remedy, and carefully helped her drink. Hours passed. The sun climbed high, turning the desert into a furnace. Inside the cabin, Elias stayed by her side. He placed a damp cloth on her forehead. He spoke softly, even though she couldn't respond. "You're safe now," he kept saying. By late afternoon, her fingers twitched. Elias leaned closer. Her eyelids fluttered, and slowly, she opened her eyes. They were a deep shade of green, striking against her pale, sunburned skin. Confusion filled her gaze. "Where am I?" she whispered. "You're safe," Elias replied gently. "You're in my home." She tried to sit up, but her body was too weak. He helped her drink more water. "My name is Elias," he said. "What's yours?" There was a pause. Then she answered, almost as if the word hurt. "Amara." For the next 2 days, Amara drifted in and out of sleep. She was severely dehydrated and exhausted. Elias gave her small portions of food, bread softened in water, bits of dried fruit. Slowly, color returned to her cheeks. When she was finally strong enough to speak clearly, he asked the question that had been burning inside him. "How did you end up alone in the desert?" Amara's eyes darkened. "I wasn't alone," she said quietly. She told him she had been traveling with a group, smugglers who promised to take her across the border to start a new life. She had been desperate. With no family and no money, she believed their promises. But, when supplies ran low and a sandstorm hit, panic spread among the group. In the chaos, she was left behind. "They thought I was slowing them down," she said, her voice trembling. So they kept walking. Elias felt anger rise in his chest. To abandon someone in the desert was a death sentence. "You're lucky," he said softly. "The desert doesn't forgive easily." Amara looked at him carefully. "Why do you live here?" she asked. Elias hadn't spoken about his past in years. But something about her presence, fragile yet resilient, opened a door in his heart. He told her about his wife, about his son, about the accident that took them both. About how the noise of the city became unbearable. About how he came to the desert to escape memories. "I thought I wanted to be alone," he admitted. "But sometimes, loneliness is louder than any city." Days turned into a week. Amara grew stronger. She began helping around the cabin, sweeping sand from the doorway, fetching small bundles of dry wood, learning how to read the desert wind like Elias did. Something unexpected happened. The cabin no longer felt empty. They spoke in the evenings, sitting outside as the sun melted into the dunes. Amara had a sharp mind and a quiet strength. She asked questions about the stars, about survival, about life before the desert. Elias found himself smiling more than he had in years. But one evening, as they watched the horizon, Amara grew quiet. "They'll come back," she said. "Who?" "The men I traveled with. If they realize I survived, they might return. Not to rescue me, but to silence me." Elias studied her face. Fear was there, real and heavy. The desert wind shifted. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. And at dawn, he saw something that made his blood run cold. In the distance, barely visible through the shimmering heat, were three figures moving toward the cabin. He didn't need binoculars. He knew. They had come back. Elias moved quickly. He told Amara to stay inside and lock the door. He stepped outside with his staff in hand. He was old, yes, but the desert had made him tougher than he looked. The three men approached, their faces hard and unreadable. One of them smirked. "Well," he said, "looks like the sand didn't finish the job." Elias stood firm. "She's not going with you," he said calmly. The men laughed. "And who's going to stop us?" "You." There was a moment of silence, heavy and electric. Then something happened that none of them expected. From behind the cabin, a cloud of dust rose. A convoy of vehicles appeared, government patrol units that monitored illegal border crossings. Elias had quietly activated an old emergency beacon he kept for extreme situations, a device installed years ago by authorities who occasionally checked on him. The smugglers turned pale. Within minutes, the officers surrounded them. Amara stepped out of the cabin, her hands trembling but her eyes strong. She pointed directly at the men. "They left me to die," she said clearly. The smugglers were arrested on the spot. As the vehicles drove away, silence returned to the desert. Amara looked at Elias. "You saved my life," she said. Elias shook his head gently. "No," he replied. "You survived. I just happened to be walking." A week later, arrangements were made for Amara to travel safely to the nearest city, legally this time. Authorities offered her protection and support to start over properly. The morning she was set to leave, the desert sky was soft and pink. She hugged Elias tightly. "You gave me a second life," she whispered. He felt tears in his eyes, something he hadn't allowed in years. "You gave me one too," he said. As the vehicle disappeared into the distance, Elias stood alone once more. But something had changed. The desert didn't feel as empty. Months later, a letter arrived. Amara had found work. She was studying. She was building a future. At the bottom of the letter, she had written, "You once told me the desert doesn't forgive easily. But maybe it doesn't forget kindness either." Elias folded the letter carefully and looked out at the endless dunes. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel like a man hiding from life. He felt like a man who had finally found a reason to keep living. And in the vast, silent desert, where survival is never guaranteed, two lost souls had found something far more powerful than fear. They found hope. The patrol vehicles disappeared beyond the dunes, their tracks slowly fading under the restless desert wind. Silence returned, deep, endless, almost sacred. Elias stood outside his cabin long after the dust had settled. His wooden staff pressed into the sand as if anchoring him to the earth. Amara was safe, but safety, he knew, was only the beginning of a different kind of journey. The cabin felt emptier than it had in weeks. The cup she used was still on the small wooden table. A folded blanket rested at the foot of the bed where she had once struggled to breathe. Elias stared at it for a long time before quietly folding it away. That evening, he sat outside as usual, watching the sunset stretch across the horizon. But something inside him had shifted. For years, the desert had been his shield, protecting him from the pain of memory. Now, for the first time, it felt like a bridge. It had brought someone into his life when he least expected it. Days passed. Elias returned to his routine, checking water reserves, reinforcing the wooden shutters, marking the movement of dunes with small stone piles. Yet every movement carried an echo. He would sometimes turn his head, half expecting to see Amara walking beside him, asking another curious question about the wind. 1 week later, a government officer returned in a small vehicle. He stepped out, removed his sunglasses, and approached the cabin. "You did a brave thing," the officer said respectfully. "Most people wouldn't have interfered." Elias shrugged. "Leaving someone to die is not something I understand." The officer nodded. "The men you helped capture were part of a larger network. Your actions may have saved more lives than you realize." Those words lingered long after the officer left. Saved more lives. Elias had spent decades believing he had failed the only lives that truly mattered, his wife and son. The accident replayed in his mind often. The rain, the flashing headlights, the sound of twisting metal. He had been driving. He had survived. They had not. For years, he carried that weight like a stone in his chest. Living in the desert felt like a form of quiet punishment. Survival had felt undeserved. But now, something small and unfamiliar stirred within him, not guilt, not grief. Purpose. 2 months later, another letter arrived. Amara wrote about the city. About crowded streets that overwhelmed her at first. About the fear that still visited her in dreams. But she also wrote about strength, how she had begun volunteering with an organization that helped displaced women. I want to be for someone what you were for me, she wrote. Elias read that line 3 times. The desert wind rustled the paper in his hands. Winter approached. The nights grew colder, the stars sharper. One evening, while reinforcing the cabin walls, Elias noticed smoke far in the distance. Not the thin line of a patrol vehicle, this was darker, uncontrolled. His instincts awakened instantly. Fire in the desert was rare but deadly. He gathered supplies, water containers, blankets, rope, and set out toward the smoke. The walk took nearly an hour. As he approached, he heard faint shouting. A small off-road vehicle had overturned near a rocky ridge. 2 young men stood beside it, panicked, while flames licked the engine. Nearby, a teenage boy sat on the sand, clutching his ankle. Tourists. Unprepared, Elias moved with surprising speed. He ordered the men to step back and used sand to smother the growing flames, throwing it in heavy waves until the fire weakened. He then rushed to the injured boy. The ankle was badly twisted, possibly broken. You shouldn't have come this far without guidance, Elias said firmly but not unkindly. The men admitted they had ignored warning signs, thinking the desert was just sand. Elias almost smiled at the irony. Nothing in the desert was ever just anything. Using his rope and a makeshift splint from broken wood, he stabilized the boy's leg. Then he activated his emergency beacon again. Within an hour, patrol services arrived. Before leaving, one of the young men looked at Elias with wide, humbled eyes. You live out here alone? He asked. Yes. Aren't you afraid? Elias glanced across the dunes. No, he said, but I respect it. That night, sitting outside his cabin, he felt something different from loneliness. He felt needed. Word began to spread quietly among authorities about the old man who knew the desert better than anyone. Patrol officers occasionally stopped by for advice about shifting routes or unstable dunes. Some brought supplies in exchange for guidance. Then, one morning, something unexpected happened. A government official arrived with a proposal. They wanted Elias to serve as a local desert advisor, an official role. He would not have to leave his cabin, but he would assist in mapping dangerous areas and educating rescue teams. For a long moment, Elias said nothing. He had chosen isolation, but isolation had not chosen him back. I am old, he finally said. The official smiled gently. Experience doesn't age. After days of quiet thought beneath the open sky, Elias agreed. The work brought subtle change. Rescue teams began visiting weekly. Elias showed them how to read wind direction by the shape of dunes, how to detect underground water by observing certain desert plants, how silence itself could signal approaching storms. You must listen, he would tell them. The desert speaks before it strikes. Months passed. Then, nearly half a year after Amara left, a familiar vehicle approached the cabin. Elias stepped outside, heart unexpectedly racing. The door opened. Amara stepped out, stronger, confident, dressed simply, but with a presence that radiated quiet determination. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she smiled. I had to see it again, she said, glancing at the endless horizon. He felt something warm and unfamiliar expand in his chest. They sat outside as they once had, watching the sun descend into gold and crimson. She told him about her studies, social work, about the women she helped, about her decision to testify against the smuggling network, helping authorities dismantle more operations. I was afraid, she admitted. But then I remembered something you said. Elias tilted his head. You said survival isn't weakness. It's strength. He didn't remember saying it. But he was glad she had heard it. As darkness settled, Amara grew serious. I don't think you're meant to stay hidden here forever, she said gently. Elias looked at the cabin, weathered wood, sand-carved edges, memories embedded in every corner. This place saved me, he said. She nodded. And now you're saving others. Maybe that was always the point. The wind moved softly between them. For years, Elias believed he had come to the desert to disappear. Now he understood something different. He had come here to heal. And healing, he realized, was not meant to be kept. The next morning, before Amara left, again, she handed him something small, a simple metal compass. In case you ever decide to walk beyond the dunes, she said with a playful smile. He held it carefully. After she drove away, Elias did not feel the crushing emptiness he once feared. Instead, he felt movement, not in his legs, but in his spirit. Weeks later, he traveled, not away from the desert, but deeper into service. He began organizing structured guidance sessions for rescue teams. He helped establish clearer desert markers to prevent travelers from losing their way. His cabin remained his home, but it was no longer his hiding place. One evening, as he stood watching the sunset, a thought came to him with unexpected clarity. He had survived the accident for a reason, not to suffer, not to punish himself, but to stand in the place where life and death often balanced, and tip the scale toward life whenever he could. The desert wind moved gently across the sand, reshaping the surface yet again. Elias smiled. The desert had once taken everything from him. Then it gave him something back. A stranger buried in the sand. A second chance. And a reminder that even in the harshest landscapes, humanity can bloom. Far beyond the horizon, in cities and villages he would never see, lives continued, some of them quietly changed because one old man chose not to walk past a hand reaching out of the sand. And in the vast, silent desert, where so many stories are swallowed by wind, this one continued, not as a tale of shock, but as a testament to courage, redemption, and the unexpected power of kindness.